Thank you. We're going to get the next panel started. The next panel is on supply chain. As a result of the pandemic, the North American trading bloc has shown the importance of location and why being located as close not only to suppliers but consumers is key. Trade between the U.S. and Mexico continues to increase year after year. An integrated and reliable supply chain is vital for the economies of both countries, where several employment sectors, including manufacturing, logistics, and retail, converge. We have an expert group of panelists up here with us today. I'd like to introduce them, and then we'll go into each of them. We'll have a brief presentation, then we'll have a conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Caroline Mays, good friend from the Texas Department of Transportation. She is Director of Planning and Modal Programs. And before that, she oversaw the Freight Mobility Plan and the State's Mobility Plan. So Caroline is an expert when it comes to international trade through the state of Texas. Next, I'd like to introduce Oscar Augusto del Cueto Cuevas. He's the President, General Manager, and Executive Representative from Kansas City Southern de Mexico. He has more than 30 years of railway industry experience, working in institutional relations, communications, operations, planning, and logistics. Next, I'd like to introduce Juan Orla, Superintendent of International Bridges, City of Mcallen. Juan is going to present the Unsalted International Bridge expansion. And so when we talk about supply chain, we have government with TxDOT, with Juan with the City of Mcallen and the important role that they play. Then we have Oscar with Kansas City Southern as a shipper, being able to say what he's seeing in the shipping world. And then we have our friend Rodney Spencer at the end. Rodney is the plant director at Navistar based here in San Antonio. So we also have a manufacturer on the panel to tell us what they're seeing and it's very interesting. They produce motors. So they produce both diesel motors, EV motors, as well as also possibly looking at hydrogen. So we'll talk about that as well. And so with that, I would like a round of applause, please, for the panelists. And then I'd like to call Caroline Mays up first. Thank you.
Good morning. Somebody. Oh, okay. Jesse, thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this forum. I'm really honored to represent Texas and TxDOT, and also be on this distinguished panel to speak about integrating supply chain. Before I move forward, I want to recognize two of my folks. Claudia Lajos is here. She's actually the International Trade and Border Planning Manager. And then Laredo Brown, who is on my team as the multimodal planner for TxDOT. So what I'll do today, I'll give you kind of a little brief overview of statewide movement of freight and goods, and then jump into border and talk a little bit about supply chain, some of the issues and items we're facing, and then really talk to you a little bit about what are we doing to address that. I think yesterday there was a lot of discussions about are we organized, and what are we doing, what should we do, and we've actually done that. So I want to share some of that with you all this morning. Next slide, please. So this slide here just outlines the magnitude of freight and goods movement growth in Texas from 2014, looking into projecting it to 2050. As you can see, today we're at 3.9 billion tons, and we're looking at pretty much doubling that by 2050 to 7.2 billion tons. That is 80% growth. You think we have a lot of trucks and trains and ships, all of that today, we're going to have more. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I move forward. Next slide, please. And then this is how goods move. And this is inclusive of what comes through our border crossing. So this is how it moves around the state of Texas. Of course, highways, trucks dominate that movement, but rail, water, air plays a big part in that movement. We did not include pipelines here, but a lot of energy commodities do move by pipelines throughout our state, and also at least cross-border as well. Next slide. And when you look specifically at the U.S.-Mexico trade, what are we looking at? You guys have heard a lot of this yesterday. Ken presented some of those numbers, but as you can see here, in the last 15 years, we've seen 94% growth. That is staggering, and we're going to see more of that as we move forward. And then when you just look at, exports alone, 106% growth over the last 15 years. A lot of you are in this day in, day out, but to just show you the magnitude of what we're looking at, if the past can show us the future, I think it is showing us that the future is not going to slow down, and I'll touch on some of those aspects later on. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the border, this is looking at goods moving by rail. And we go back to, looking at 1996. Some of you know that NAFTA was established in 1994, but we have data going back. And you look at that, rail crossing the border has grown at 6.3% annually. So you just look at that growth and that magnitude, but look at what we're projecting to, although it's going to be a little bit slower, some of the, going from 6 to 3% annually between 2019 and 2050. One, because we're probably going to face some capacity constraints, which we're already doing right now with the rail being able to move a lot of goods throughout the border. So there's going to be needed investments to be made to be able to accommodate the growth, especially when it comes to rail movement. Next slide. On the truck side, again, going back to 1996, we've seen 3.3% annual growth during that time frame, and actually we're projecting that on the truck side is actually going to grow much higher annually at 3.2% between 2019 and 2050. But when you look at some of those growth, it's staggering. We have at least 4.6 million trucks today transversing the border, and we're projecting that to pretty much almost triple by 2050. So you're looking at a very staggering numbers when it comes to trucks moving through the border. Next slide, please. And one thing that, we've been tracking, especially since the pandemic, is the activity related to nearshoring. And we actually, were in Monterey last month, July, and spent time with the industry in Monterey, talked to them about nearshoring and got their input on it. But as you can see here, definitely nearshoring is here and is going to continue. Especially with the pandemic. Some of you heard yesterday, kind of the, restructuring of global supply chains, whereby we're moving from, this global supply chains to more regional supply chains, whereby North American products are being manufactured, being produced in North America. China is still going to be a player. People saying, oh yeah, all the manufacturing going to move from China back. They're not, because they got to serve the Chinese, the Asian market, and other markets throughout the world. So you're seeing that when we went to Monterey, Larry, they were telling us they have zero availability of warehousing. They cannot build it fast enough to be able to accommodate all the companies coming. But then there's also a lot of, foreign direct investment in Monterey and in Mexico, in Saltillo and Torreon. It's mind-boggling the magnitude of the investments happening there. So I wanted to share that with you. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, and then, what does that mean when it comes to really looking at, the impacts of nearshoring? I already showed you some of this, but again, we're looking at staggering numbers of trucks, rail, goods moving through our borders, and certainly it's going to require investments, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Reasons for nearshoring. This is some of the things we heard from the stakeholders when we were in Monterey, when we had the workshop in Monterey. What are the reasons? Why are we seeing nearshoring? Reduced transportation costs. You guys remember during the pandemic, we couldn't get PPEs here because we were waiting for them to come from China. So how do you reduce those costs? And that's nearshoring is definitely one. Labor costs. What we heard from the industry in Monterey, which is kind of mind-blowing, is that it's actually now cheaper to manufacture labor costs in Mexico, but also the quality of the labor force in Mexico is better than the quality of labor force in China. So that was a big one. Some of it a lot of talk the last day or so about, being greener. Certainly, that's a big thing that the industry is looking for. Avoiding loss of intellectual property rights under USMCA. Really the big one is the requirement for North American content in the automotive, sector in the vehicles. That has brought a lot of the biggest growing supply chain areas is in the automotive sector, because now you got to produce 76% of North American content. Faster response to market demands. I mentioned pandemic. We really struggle because we didn't have what we needed to make PPEs or medical supplies in North America. We were relying on, outside global sources to be able to source those things out. You guys have heard about chips and chip issues, the challenges. We can't make cars, or we're making them, but we're missing the chip components. So now you got Samsung expanding in Austin. You got, Texas Instrument expanding in Sherman to be able to address those. So you're starting to see really getting closer to home so we can serve our needs in North America. That means Mexico, US, and Canada. Supply chain resiliency. And I'm talking about this a little bit because I want you guys to understand from a transportation perspective, how can we make our supply chains resilient? We saw it break down during the pandemic, really, and it's still broken. So how do we make it much more resilient moving forward? And then just having better control of our supply chains and not let other countries or others outside of the North American trading bloc control that. So that's what we heard from the industry in Monterey, but also we're hearing that all over. Really, the sense of urgency is that North America needs to be a trading bloc that can trade within itself and can take care of its own people when something like the pandemic happens. Next slide. So this one, real quickly, this one we did as part of the freight mobility, looking at, really commodities and supply chains, 2019 versus 2050. Just look at the top 5 and see some of the changes there. I mentioned automotive and, motor vehicle parts. That actually by 2050, it will be the top supply chain in Texas, but also cross-border. So just kind of wanted to share that. Next slide, please. This one is specific to the border. This was part of the work that we did for the border master plan, and we highlighted the top cross-border supply chains. And this is, again, really, really telling that you really have high technology, motor vehicles, and machinery, kind of the top 3 consistent supply chains that we're going to see not just today, but also in the future. Next slide. Why are supply chains important to Texas? I won't really bore you with a lot of this, but you get these slides and you can see why it's so important to Texas. Our economy depends on it. Jobs depend on it. Our GDP depends on supply chain. So really for us in Texas, supply chain resiliency, effectiveness is a crucial part of what we do. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to show you, again, this, why is supply chain efficiency, resiliency important to the U.S.? And some of these numbers will kind of blow your mind. We trade a lot with Mexico. We trade a lot with, Canada. So just making sure, that this is what's at stake when we talk about supply chains. Next slide. And, one thing that was mentioned here, when we do our border planning efforts, we don't just look at the Texas-Mexico border. We look at how does this impact the rest of the country, meaning U.S., meaning Mexico. And this map right here shows the GDP impact of Texas-Mexico trade or U.S.-Mexico trade coming through Texas. So you can see in the United States, the top states, Texas, Michigan, Illinois, California, and Ohio. So this is trade coming through our borders, then going to all of those states. Then when you look on the Mexican side, look at the states. You got, the states that, border us, but some of it are states that don't border us. So you look at the impact of the trade goes far beyond, we call this the sphere of influence, because again, this is supporting the entire North American continent. Next slide. So a lot of talk yesterday. Are we organizing? Should we organize? What should we do, et cetera? We have already done that on the transportation side, especially Texas and Mexico. The Texas-Mexico Border Transportation Master Plan is a binational plan that was developed with extensive binational stakeholder engagement and outreach, looking at both the federal, state, local, private sector. We actually formed 3 binational committees that are still active today, and we're using them to be able to help us to provide input to some of the things we're doing. But in a nutshell, this plan laid out, one, what are the key issues and challenges of cross-border movement of people and goods, but then also what are some of the recommendations, policy, program, project recommendations, and also it outlines the timelines on when we need to make those investments to be able to facilitate the movement of people and goods toward our borders today, but also in the future. Next slide. So just to kind of show you why did we spend that much time working on the border master plan, but also why does supply chains matters. This is the cost of congestion at our border crossings. And when you look at it, this has staggering numbers. This is what we're losing by congestion at our border crossing that we measure, that we can put numbers on it, because this is what a lot of our policymakers look at to see what's the cost of doing nothing. And this is what we're showing. If we do nothing, this is what we as Texas, Mexico, US will lose in terms of what we could actually gain in our economic competitiveness. A lot of that was discussed yesterday and today. This is where rubber meets the road. This is why we need to invest in our infrastructure, on cross-border infrastructure in both countries. Next slide. So part of the border master plan, we identified a ton of projects. And as you see here, 661 projects at a staggering cost of $37.4 billion. We identified projects in Mexico, in US, Texas. We identified border crossing projects. We identified corridor, multimodal corridor projects, highway, rail, all of that we identified it, and it's here. And so now really moving forward is really how do we implement these projects? It's going to take everybody. TxDOT, we're not the only one. We have bridge owners here. We have stakeholders. We have private sector. Everybody has to do their part to make sure that this is implemented moving forward. Next slide. And I think this is my final slide. And I wanted to show this slide because one of the questions we got asked during the border master plan development is like, so what? You develop this, what does this mean? So we show that if we implemented all the 185 border crossing projects, this means existing bridges like Laredo expanded, but the new ones yesterday, Laredo 4-5 was mentioned. If you actually implement all of those, this would the benefits that we'll gain. We can cut border wait time by 60% if we implemented all the border crossing projects. So just kind of, to show you that, imagine if we cut border wait time by 60%. How much more can we move between the US and Mexico, between Texas and Mexico? So I think this is my last slide. Next slide. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share this with you, and be happy to engage you moving forward. I know a lot of you are interested in water infrastructure, but I think it was mentioned earlier, transportation is where the rubber meets the road. You can't maintain those cultures. You can't maintain the movement of people. We can't be competitive as a North American trading bloc if we don't address some of the infrastructure, transportation infrastructure issues that's facing us today, but also in the future. So thank you.
Next, I'd like to ask Rodney Spencer from Navistar to make his presentation.
All right. So I'm an old manufacturing guy in a room full of financial people. That makes me very uncomfortable. All right. So real quick, I was just asked to give a brief overview of San Antonio and our presence here. So let's say real quick. So Navistar is a commercial manufacturer of heavy duty vehicles. So we make class 6, 7, and 8 trucks. So heavy duty trucks you see on the highway, crossing the border, all that good stuff. That's what we make. Basically, the picture that you see there is a current truck lineup of the different vehicles that Navistar makes. When we decided to move to San Antonio, our manufacturing facility opened in January. Our first truck came off the line the first week of January of 2022. When we decided to move here, we were an independently owned company headquartered in Lisle, Illinois. In the middle of this process, Navistar was actually purchased. So July 1st of 2021, we were purchased by a company called Traton. Probably a name not many of you are familiar with, but you may be familiar with their other brands. They also own MAN, and they own Scania. and also Volkswagen in Brazil, Volkswagen trucks in Brazil. So for any European knowledge, Scania and MAN, big truck manufacturers in the European continent. Traton is actually the primary owner of Traton is Volkswagen. So essentially at this point, Navistar is part of the Traton Group, which is owned by Volkswagen. So that's kind of where our structure is right now. If you go to the next slide, please. So San Antonio factory statistics. So like I said, we opened the factory January 3rd, 2022. It was a $250 million capital investment. Tack on another $55 million expense on top of that. Okay. Construction started December 2020. It's an assembly plant. We do robotic cab welding. All of our painting is done there. So cabs, hoods, plastic parts, chassis components, and logistics. So we have our own logistics warehouse and logistics center as part of the factory as well. First truck started January 3rd, 2022. The site we chose is south of San Antonio, probably about a 15-minute drive from here. In the south end of town, it's on 428 acres. The factory itself occupies about 120 acres, so we have lots of room for improvement there. We have 920,000 square feet under roof. So again, it is a very substantial manufacturing facility. Design capacity of 52 trucks per shift. We have the ability to work up to 3 shifts, of course. So our capacity could theoretically get up to about 140 trucks a day. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you that that's the designed capacity. I can push it farther than that, get more revenue. Right now, we have 620 employees. That's full employment for single shift operation. If we went to another shift, we'd add about another 500 employees. Okay. And then the current models we make, this Navistar Lingo or MV and HVs, we're doing primarily diesel trucks right now at our factory. Most of our electric vehicles are actually produced out of our plant in Escobedo, just outside Monterey. But we are capable of building electric vehicles at our factory as well. Okay. Next slide. So this was a picture of our first truck. So it's been a dry year, right? All right. Audience participation is good. So it's been a very dry year. Last year, San Antonio had record rainfall. So our site from end of April to beginning of August was mud. This year, dry as a bone. So we probably added about $15 million in cost to our project because of the rain last year. So if we had delayed 1 year, we would have had a much more affordable factory. And also COVID, much less of an impact. You can see this is the first truck. Everyone's in hard hats. That will tell you that we weren't quite done with all of our overhead work when we built our first truck. So anyway, next slide. That's it. So right now, I just want to give you guys a quick background on Navistar. Any questions you may have about supply chains, why we chose here, our experience in San Antonio, experience in Texas, happy to discuss that in the panel questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. Next, I'd like to call Oscar Augusto del Cueto Cuevas.
Hello. As you can see, this is Kansas City Southern and the president of Kansas City Southern de Mexico. This is just to give you an update for the situation. You hear the ambassador that we were planning to do the groundbreaking for the second span in the bridge there in Laredo for this year. By the end of this year, we are planning to do it in October, the end of October, maybe November. Let me, next slide, please. Let me give you some overview for Kcsm. We are a subsidiary of KCS Railway. We are operating since 25 years ago in Mexico. We have investment there in Mexico for over $4.4 billion US. We have increasing our cross-border trade, as was mentioned by Carolyn, that the increase by rail is by year 6.3%, and we are making part of that trade between the U.S. and Mexico. We transport close to the 30% of the country rail cargo there in Mexico. For these 25 years, we were increasing more than double in the capacity there in Mexico to move more cargo. We have 4,251 kilometers of track, We serve 4 ports. We pass through 15 states in the country, mainly in the northeast of Mexico. And as I mentioned, 4.4 billion of investment. Next slide, please. Just to talk about a little bit of the disruptions that we have in the supply chain due to the pandemic. We all suffer about this situation. The World Bank did a survey in different companies in more than 60 countries. And part of the results, they were mentioning that in a quarter of the company sales fell down by 50%. On average, the states decreased, or sales decreased, for 27% overall. And 65% of the companies adjusted the payroll, reducing hours and salaries. That was the main impact for this situation in the pandemic. In the next slide is just to talk about a little bit this opportunity that we see in Mexico as a nearshoring. The nearshoring is the obviously opportunity for Mexico to bring more supply for the companies that we have in Asia. And now we are seeing there in Kcsm that we see this trend as an opportunity to increase and further restrain the movement of freight into the North American market. We have this TEMEC, or the USMCA, which is the legal frame to work in this situation. And we are seeing some trends that is bringing more and more supplies there in Mexico. Mainly, as was mentioned by Caroline, is the auto parts that is increasing in Mexico. We are big suppliers for the auto industry there in Mexico, not just with auto parts, but also with finished vehicles. The next slide is just to see those main drivers for the nearshoring that we see in Mexico. Some of them were addressed by Caroline, but it's obviously that is the shorter supply chain to destination markets. We learned the lesson for this pandemic that having these supplies, so these supplies there in the Asia area is causing, or we're causing problems. Fewer opportunities for delays is looking for this nearshoring, better time to management for efficiency and productivity. Also, the demographics, the cultural affinity and connection. This is a big opportunity for the border between Mexico and the US. Better time to management. Others like the global trends, environmental, as you know, we need to talk about the pandemic, but also the tension between the US and China, and the Russia and Ukraine war that is causing these nearshoring opportunities for us. What about the next slide is just to talk about a little bit the cross-border trade. We have this 25 years Kcsm has provided a direct connection between the US and Mexico. Major logistics, we have the main gate for the interchange between Mexico and the US, which is Laredo. But we also operate in Brownsville, Matamoros. We have the bridge there and interchange with the Union Pacific there here in the US. The international cargo, this is on some numbers for January to April. We see that the imports into Mexico coming from here, from the US, has decreased 2.8%, but the exports from Mexico to the US has grown 17%. These numbers in the below part is just the number of tons that we have, metric tons that we move, as you can see there in the export and the import. Even though the import has been going down, we saw a big number there for the imports into Mexico. Most of those products are going to Canada and the US. The next slide is just to provide a little bit for the railroad system in Mexico. Mexico has a railroad network that covers mainly the whole country. We have two main companies there in Mexico. One of them is Ferromex, and the other one is us, Kansas City Southern. The railroad is very relevant in Mexico and complement the international transit. We are serving both sides of the Pacific area and the Mexican Gulf. Through the ports, we serve the port of Tampico and Altamira there in the Gulf of Mexico, and also Veracruz. We reach the Pacific side through the port of Lázaro Cárdenas. Obviously, to say that rail is the safest and most efficient means for the transportation to move large volumes and cargo over the long distance. Those are the areas that we serve: the chemicals, energy, auto industry, steel, agriculture, and construction. We have in the next slide just a quick overview for the terminals that we own there in Mexico. We have three terminals, intermodal terminals, that we move containers from the port, from the US into Mexico, mainly with auto parts and goods into Mexico market. North, close to Monterrey, in the north of Monterrey area, is Salinas Victoria. The other one is San Luis Potosí. There in the middle of the network, we have this central point in San Luis Potosí. And also we have Puerta Mexico. Puerta Mexico is located in Toluca, very near to Mexico City. Those are three terminals that we own there in Mexico City with huge capacity and ready to increase the capacity there in Mexico to move containers. The next slide is just to refer those ports that I was mentioning that we serve. Altamira, there in the port of Altamira next to Tampico, is there in the Gulf of Mexico, and also Veracruz. We recently have a direct access to Veracruz. Recently was last year, actually, we were giving the service to Veracruz through the other provider, which is Ferrosur. We were delivering all the goods to them, the cars, and then the final switch to the port. Now we have a direct access. The port of Veracruz built a new connection to the new port, and now we are serving that port directly. And there, Lázaro Cárdenas. Lázaro Cárdenas is located in the Pacific area with a huge capacity. We have two terminals there, APM and Hutchinson ports, that has the only first phase. That means that they can grow and they can increase the capacity there in the port of Lázaro Cárdenas. And the next slide is something that you maybe know about this joint venture and this new company that we are creating. Canadian Pacific bought Kansas City in last December 14. And with this, we are creating the first railroad that is connecting the three countries, Mexico, US, and Canada. This is a very good news for the whole three countries and the markets that we are now reaching through the connection by rail, not only in Mexico, but the opportunities to grow for the exports into the Canada markets and the US markets. As you recall, we were serving only up to Kansas City, and now with the connection to the Canadian Pacific, we will reach markets in the east of the US and the whole country in Canada from the west to the east. This is going to be a 32,000 of track connecting the ports, the fair level ports in the three countries. And the name of this company will be CPKC. In the case of Mexico, it's going to be CPKC de Mexico. And this is going to be the only east-west railroad stretching between the northeastern the US and the Atlantic Canada with Texas and Mexico, as well as into the upper Midwest. This is a big opportunity. And as you can see there in the below side of this slide is the international cruise. We have the only point in the railroad industry there in Mexico, which is Laredo, that has this international cruise. That means in the past, before we have this international cruise, that we were having our crew, our Mexican crew, up to the middle of the bridge. They leave the train there, and then the crew from the US came, pick up the train, and move the train into the US. Now we are moving the trains between both countries with only one crew that is going into the US and into Mexico, and is certified by the US Department of Transportation, also for the FRA too, and our Mexican employees that are moving those trains between the two countries. And with that, we save in average 30 to 35 minutes per train just in the crossing between Mexico and the US. And some of you here yesterday that it was mentioned, this is the only point that we have the CBP and the tax department in Mexico, SAT or Aduanas, ANAM, the customs working together. They are in the same office. They are inspecting the trains with the extra gamma ray machines, working together. That means that they are inspecting those trains going south or going north in the same location. This is the only point that we have this. This is Laredo, Texas. Finally, the next slide, just to something that you know, the USMCA that guarantees the free trade in North America, guarantees trade and investment security. And this is for us the legal framework for continue investing in Mexico. We have recently a commitment in Mexico to invest 322 million in Mexico just for the Celaya bypass, which is a big project there in the region of the Bajío region there in Mexico that is going to run around Celaya city, plus 122 million that we have for this year in different projects. And the next slide is the project that we were mentioning in different points. This is the new Laredo Bridge. We're going to build this second span. It's going to be an investment of 75 million for this project that we're going to kick off on this October, November this year. And the goal is the completion by the end of the next year, 2023. This Nuevo Laredo border crossing is the link to the cross-border corridor. And with that, we're going to eliminate the windows. We are operating now through windows, 4 hours north, 4 hours south. And with this, we're going to have 24/7 interchange between Mexico and the US by rail, operating with the second span there in Nuevo Laredo. This is going to be additional parallel section on the rail bridge that we have in Nuevo Laredo. Next slide is the efficiency option for the rail. I'm going to skip this one. And next one is just to talk a little bit the sustainability projects, the fuel efficiency that we have, some of those actions that we have in place for different activities to save fuel, to be more friendly with the environmental. The next slide is just the green locomotives that we have since several years. This is the graph that we are saving fuel there in Mexico due to the use of these we call eco power locomotives there in Mexico, which is improving the tonnage assigned by train, the shutdown of the locomotives, which is automatic shutdown after 30 minutes of idle. The locomotive is going to be stopped automatically. Some different actions that we have. And finally, the next slide, I'm going to leave this for you to know that we have this plan we are calling the 60,000 challenge in benefit for the butterfly monarch there in Mexico. We identified that this butterfly is taking the same road that we have between Canada, US, and Mexico. They are running over our tracks. And with that, we're going to put some trees in different points. And the final one is just to put these 60,000 trees, there in Michoacan. As you know, the monarch, the butterfly, is sitting there in Michoacan. And the challenge is to get $1,000 for these trees. We already overpassed this amount, and thank you for all the support. We receive a lot of support for this project, and we are planning to final this challenge in November this year. And with that, we're going to put our piece of support for this beautiful butterfly that we have in our road between the three countries. And with that, thank you. I open to say the next slide to say thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Calixto. Thank you, John, Salvador, all the team for NADBank for having us here on this beautiful panel. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to call Juan from the city of Mcallen to discuss a very important project in relation to the supply chain.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this forum. Next slide, please. The backbone of commerce and trade for most cities, well, commerce and trade is the backbone for most cities, and this certainly is true for border towns, especially the city of Mcallen. City of Mcallen operates two international bridges. One of them is the Mcallen Hidalgo International Bridge, which is only a vehicular and pedestrian bridge. And its Hidalgo and borders Reynosa, Tamaulipas. Reynosa is a city north Tamaulipas that has a population of about 2 million people. The Hidalgo Bridge, the Mcallen Hidalgo Bridge, is the only pedestrian bridge, and we see about 112,000 pedestrians coming through that bridge on a monthly basis. It has 220,000 vehiclers traveling south and north on a monthly basis as well. A little bit to the west, next slide, please. A little bit to the west, we have Unsalted International Bridge. And that bridge is Mission Borders Reynosa, and it's the outer skirts of Reynosa. This bridge is important because it connects to Highway 40 on the Mexican side, and also connects to I-2 on the US side. We're about 137 miles away from Monterrey, Nuevo León. It's about a 2.5-hour drive. That's if you're not speeding. Otherwise, some people say they can make it in about less than 2 hours, but haven't tested that. We are currently have about 100,000 vehicles coming through that bridge. We have empty southbound traffic, and we don't have the infrastructure to have commercial traffic on the Unsalted Bridge. However, this year, and through the help of NADBank, we were able to secure a $63 million loan for the project. We had already had $22 million with the state of Texas. So the project came in at $81 million. So it's very exciting to be here. And thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Calixto and Salvador. Next slide. Reynosa, this is a little picture of what Reynosa is and the 2 million inhabitants. Reynosa has 11 industrial parks. It employs, those industrial parks have approximately 153 maquiladora plants. They employ over 140,000 people, and the primary, as spoken here before, but the three primary sectors are automotive, medical equipment, and electronics. We recently experienced what it means to close a bridge on April 11th, 2022. There are protesters, and they closed the only bridge that we have in the region, which is the FAR International Bridge. It closed for several days, but we surveyed 78 companies, and they said that there's more than 600 trucks, close to 800 trucks that weren't able to cross their products, and that gave them losses of over $120 million in one day. And so that is the impact of not having enough bridges. I know that Carolyn says, we need more bridges across the borders. We agree. And thanks to Open Mind and Commerce, we're going to be able to have one additional one this year. So we're pro international bridge. Our vision to move forward is to provide the transportation and manufacturing companies an added option. We're not trying to take away anything. We're just trying to make the pie a lot bigger, and be able to go through the ports efficiently and effectively. I know that with having more ports, you're going to be able to bring produce, and you're going to bring manufacturing goods through them. And the object is for them not to stand or sit idle at the bridges. Next slide. This is a study that we did, and these are the added benefits in a 30-year plan of what this region will have, or what our region will have, just by having one bridge. And it's over, if you add the benefits of trucks idling, the environmental impact benefits, the cost for having trucks up on the bridge, they add up to more than $642 million. And that's with an investment of $81 million. So we're very excited to what the future is going to bring. Our project starts, we break ground in about 2 months, and gentlemen, you'll be invited to the groundbreaking. And the project should be up and running by first quarter of 2024. Charlie, I'm just looking at you. So without saying any more, thank you very much for having me, and if there's any questions, I'll be here.
So I have questions for the panelists now, and we'll just go up and down until we run out of time, and then maybe we'll also have time for some audience participation. So Caroline, you had talked about the border master plan and identifying the number of projects and the huge amount of financing those projects. As a planner, and you also talked about how imports and exports have increased by almost 100% in the last 15 years, and if you project that out, as a planner, how do you tackle 650 border projects? How do you tackle the billions of dollars needed?
Yeah, no, great question. And in the border master plan, we took those 600 projects and we prioritized them by short term, medium term, and long term. And really stressing the short term, a lot of it is really operational improvements. Some of the work that Charlie and CBP are doing to invest in technology deployment in the border to be able to do faster inspections, but also the processes within the border crossings themselves. So a lot of those discussions happen with CBP and the federal on both sides, the aduanas, to be able to do that. So that's kind of one way we tackle that. And then the medium-term projects, and then the long-term projects, when you really look at, adding new border crossings, what that entails. So some of those are longer-term projects. So that's how we did it. And then the second thing also we did was, I mentioned that TxDOT is not the only entity involved. There's, I think, over 60 different plus agencies involved when it comes to border crossings. So all of those, we identified whose jurisdiction it is, who is responsible for that project, and kind of the ownership of that project. And they have to own that timeline and the funding too. The projects in the border master plan are funded by a variety of funding sources from both countries. So being able to identify, the funding as well, but a huge part of the 661 projects are not funded at all. So out of the $34.7 billion, I think we're at maybe 28 plus, billion dollars of unfunded needs. So that's why I think the border master plan lays out what's needed. And if we do it, this is what we will get out of it, return on investment. But I'm not saying that the 661 are funded, they're not. A bulk of it is not funded. So I think that's, how you tackle it, short, medium term. And then finally is the continued collaboration with everybody. The discussions are ongoing. On our side, on the Texas side, we're actually TxDOT. Whatever we can do, we're advancing a lot of those recommendations in the border master plan as we speak right now. You mentioned, the border crossing was shut down, and the challenge we heard was when one border crossing is shut down, how do you pivot to the next one? So we're going to be assessing connectivity issues between all the border crossings. Last year, Del Rio was shut down. It took trucks and vehicles going to Eagle Pass. That was about 60 miles on a 2-lane roadway, at least on our side. So how do we tackle that? So those are some of the short-term things we're going to be doing.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Juan, you talked about, and I think you did a great job of explaining the project, but let's talk about what got you to this point. I mean, working federal support, legislation, and how did you get to the point that you are today to be able to finance the project?
Well, thank you very much. I think that if you can just Google 3 acronyms, 3 letters, and you'll find out that they're part of a government agency somewhere. We've worked on both sides of the border with the Mexican and U.S. side, and you have to collaborate with both sides and see what the needs are. And it's very important, like Carolyn says, to really listen to what your constituents want, what the industry wants, and the needs. So we heard from our logistic companies, from truck drivers, we would get everybody to speak out exactly what they wanted, and if the demand was there, and the demand is there. And so what we did was then we went full force and then sell the product to Mexico, and Mexico was on board. And it's not just one agency. You talk SST. We had Rogelio Rivero here yesterday. We had aduanas. You have now SAT. You have many different organizations. Just like in the United States, we have GSA, we have CBP, and everybody has to be on board on this. So once you get everybody on board, the project then becomes somewhat easier.
Mhm. Thank you, Juan. Oscar, you talked about the increase in exports that you've seen through shipping. Can you directly tie that, one, to the nearshoring as your customer base has increased, as you're shipping more north? And then I just wanted to comment, I thought it was very, very interesting, the sustainability, the number of trucks that you take off the road by using the railroad. So I just want to make that comment.
Thank you. Yes, we are seeing this is not happening immediately, the nearshoring. We see some companies that are coming and be close to the production areas. That mainly happening right now in the auto industry. We saw that there in the Bajío area. As you know, we have 4 or 5 different automakers in that area. Some of them are calling the alliance shoring, that are sharing these providers services between them. But we are seeing some of them doing already the investments to create these facilities and bring some of the production that they are having in other countries into Mexico. Some of those are happening there in the border. Reynosa, close to Mcallen, there is some of electronics that are coming into Mexico to be the providers into the U.S. markets. Calling about the number of trailers or trucks that we take off out of the roads, we did the calculation that every train with 120 cars, box cars, coil cars, or freight cars into the train is equivalent to 300 trailers that we are moving into Mexico. We did the analysis for that. We are creating 4 jobs in Mexico. For every job that we have in the rail industry is 4 jobs in Mexico around the industry. And the other calculation is that we did is we are more efficient in carbon emissions, 75% less than the trucks. Sorry to say that.
Thank you, Oscar. Rodney, you had talked about why San Antonio was selected. And as we talk about being closer to consumers, if you could expand on that. And then I know before the panel started, we talked about EV market demand for motors right now, as well as possibly hydrogen motors that Navistar is looking at doing. So if you could just kind of elaborate a little bit on both those points.
Okay, take the first one. Why San Antonio? We have 3 major production facilities outside of San Antonio. We have one in Tulsa, we have one in Huntsville, Alabama, and then we have a very significant plant in Escobedo, Mexico. So San Antonio is right smack dab in the middle of that. Now, why are you moving the whole manufacturing base down south? It's because of the manufacturing opportunities in Mexico. You want to shorten your supply chain. You want to reduce your inbound material costs. You've got a very, very mature, strong automotive components industry in Monterrey, so you want to be close to that. The advantages of going to Mexico versus other places, the time zone's the same, the language barrier is not there. It's just much easier to do business with Mexico and our supply base than it is other countries, and being close to Mexico is a strategic advantage to us for a lot of reasons: design, management of supply chains, transportation costs, all that good stuff. So really an excellent place to be. Plus in South Texas, labor availability is very key. We have complementary partners in the area like Toyota and Caterpillar, so you have an established workforce and knowledge base here already. So a lot of really, really strong reasons to be in San Antonio. Get into your second part of that question: EV or hydrogen, diesel. Your question to me earlier was, how big is EV taking off? Slowly, I guess is the best way to put that. A lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of investment, a lot of technology breakthroughs. All that's very exciting. But from a market perspective right now, EV is still a very small part of the market. So I think diesel is still going to be the primary engine of choice for several years. I think the technology for EV needs to continue to develop. The cost of EV needs to become more competitive, and the other issue with EV is just going to be building up the supply chains. Right now, battery supply chains are challenging, I guess is the best way to put that. So they're expensive. Raw materials are challenging. So we've really got to beef up that battery supply chain before you can get to mass production. As far as hydrogen goes, hydrogen also a viable opportunity. Hydrogen is just another way to charge electric batteries. I think you'll see us and our competitors are all putting multiple bets on the table, which how hydrogen succeeds versus electric really is going to end up being a market-driven decision. There's advantages to hydrogen, there's advantages to electric. As a true customer-oriented business, it's going to be we'll be ready for whatever the customer in the market wants. So they're both going to be long-term viable options. It's just a question of which one wins out, or do they both win out in different ways and control different segments of the market, which is also a possibility.
Thank you. We have time for one or two audience questions. Is there any questions from the audience? No? Yes? Can we get him a microphone, please? Oh, well, there's mics in the back. Sorry.
Hey, thanks. My name's Austin Collins. I work for Red Energia. We're an electric supplier in Mexico. And I guess my question is maybe for Rodney and for Kansas City Southern. As you think about your binational supply chains, this yesterday and today, this conference focused on a lot of infrastructure projects, so water, power, sanitation. What do you think about in terms of prioritizing those projects and the people here that are promoting those projects? What do you see in your supply chain as kind of the critical path to having a successful either manufacturing or shipping, operation in either Mexico or the United States?
I didn't know you didn't. Okay. So I tell all my employees the best day at work is boring, right? You don't want an exciting day. The best supply chain is a boring supply chain. It's predictable. Your customers can build a product on time. They can ship on time. They can deliver on time. It shows up when you expect it. We're running JIT inventory, right? DPF after treatment that goes on a truck, that's $15,000. An engine is $25,000, right? You just don't want to carry that much inventory. So you need predictability, okay? So when you start talking about Mexico to the US, why does Mexico have a huge advantage over Asia? Predictability, short lead times, right? And you can expedite, you can drive the trucks yourself. You can go down there and work with the supplier to get product out the door. So you talk about all those things are important. You want to talk short term, shorten the border crossing time. Second, improve the roads. All right. What's the drive from Monterey to here? 6 hours, right? You want to make a shipment from Monterey to here, you're looking at 18 to 20. Okay. On a consistent basis, that's what you can count. You can do better than that here and there, but you've got to shorten that transit time. You've got to make it predictable. Sometimes the truck arrives in 7 hours, sometimes it's 2 days. Got to shorten that unpredictability. All right. Now you start talking about issues that's short term. Long term, you start talking about the viability of the manufacturing region. Right. Monterey's got a severe water problem right now. That is starting to impact our suppliers' abilities to get people into work and to get product out the door. Those types of issues have to be resolved. I shouldn't say have to be resolved, but it's going to impact the success of that region and the cross-border trade going into the future. So the answer is all of it. We need the bridges. We need better border crossing times. We need better agreements on truckers, not having to do transfer loads and dray loads exchanges at the border. We need all of that.
I just add for that some of the projects that we are building now is capacity. I do believe that we need more capacity, yards, bridges, double main for railroads in some areas that we need to serve the industry out of the traffic between the trains just passing through these points. But I agree that in the border, we need to do more quickly process, to be more engaged between Mexico and the U.S. authorities to create this transaction more easy. Waiting in the border or so many inspections occurring in the border, that has to be avoided. We are pushing hard to do the inspections in the region, in Mexico or in the U.S. to those freight that is crossing the border. The idea is to have the inspection and approval on the origin and the final destination. If you need to check one car or one specific item inside of one car, that need to happen in the final destination. We are working on that. We need to improve the process. We need to implement more technology, interchange of information between the authorities between Mexico and the US. I do believe that is that the actions that we need to take to improve the supply chain and the times, which is important.
And can I just add on the electric vehicle, issue? Part of the national U.S., the federal level, we just had a national transportation bill recently, and within that bill, every state, including ours, has to develop electric vehicle infrastructure, because right now, if you have electric vehicle and you're driving, let's say from here to Laredo, there's no place that you can charge in case you run out of power. So that's one thing that we're working on right now. We actually develop a plan. We're going to be working with industry to develop electric charging facilities throughout our interstate system to be able to facilitate, the manufacturing and then the adoption, because now a lot of times people have to charge the electric vehicles in their house, but once you're out on the road, can you drive 500 miles? And then for the trucking industry, that's the biggest challenge. At least they want to, either battery or electric charger that drives 500 miles before they have to charge, because that takes away the time the driver has to drive because of hours of service. If he's going to spend an hour, 2 hours charging the truck, that is his time that he could be using to drive that he will lose. So just wanted to add that.
No, thank you very much. Very important addition to the conversation. Well, that's the time that we had for the panel. So please give the panelists a nice warm round of applause. Thank you all very much.